Folks, let's get started. Hope you're having a good afternoon and hope you survived the storms last night. It was crazy. Hope you're safe and healthy. My name is Rob Eyler, and I want to thank the Smart Workforce Center for sponsoring this. I'm an economist, and I'm going to walk you through where economists see the next 12 months and in some ways the next few years in terms of our economy, and talk also about California and Del Norte County in terms of thinking about where local areas may be going and some of the dynamics happening there. We're going to start with a relatively high focus in terms of the national economy. So where economists are seeing the biggest things over the next 12 months starts with the Biden administration, what spending may be taking place with respect to how the White House is going to look at Congress to continue to help relieve some of the pressures coming from the COVID-19 recession. And a lot of the data I'm going to show you today are about labor market data, but also some financial market data, and just really the total idea of where the national economy is going as best as I can see it. So how the White House drives spending in Congress going to happen probably one of two ways. We'll probably have a third round of fiscal stimulus and a lot of push to get some governmental investment on the move, where the government's actually making purchases of goods and services to try to drive more jobs. The fiscal stimulus packages, we now have a second round that's out there, really meant to provide a bridge over troubled water and not solve longer term problems. As long as our economy starts to recover, what we've done is the right thing. We have bridged over the gap, but there's always an opportunity cost. And later I'll talk about debt markets and the building up of more debt, including how our households might see some more, even though we haven't seen much of it yet. But really what the government is trading is debt at the household for debt at the federal government level. We need those vaccines, and we need our social interactions to adjust in such a way, or say the vaccines need to be effective, and then we need to adjust in such a way that we can get businesses back open, schools back open, and get people back to work generally. Will we go back to a pre-COVID situation? Probably not for some time. And even then, I think the shadow effects of this on how we work, where we work, and the costs of doing business are all going to change, unfortunately, for a little less efficient economy, at least in the short term. However, before we can even get started, we've got to get those caseloads down and take the pressure off of our healthcare systems, especially in California, because most of the damage of the COVID-19 recession has been on our lower wage workers. And we've seen an increase in social services demand, thus costing our cities and counties more money just to try to keep people from having to make panic decisions, or really just from a humanitarian standpoint, making sure people have food on the table, which of course the fiscal stimulus money in both rounds, including the augmented unemployment insurance benefits, were meant to provide some bridge financing, if you will, for folks that have been out of work and continue to be out of work over a long period of time. So how all those come together in terms of where we might be headed from a labor market and ultimately an overall economic recovery standpoint are critical factors to get through 2021. Let's now look at a bunch of data, starting with the way people become unemployed. One of the things that's different about this recession than the last one, and most of the last ones since the Second World War, has been the surge in temporary job layoffs when this all started. These data are from January 2007 forward on a monthly basis and are going to show a bunch of different ways that people become unemployed. This time it was started by temporary job loss. And then we started to see that job loss fade. Now, part of that means that people got their jobs back, but unfortunately, another part of that is that people became permanent job losers. And as you can see, that little blue hill here on the left-hand side of this graph is the Great Recession. The bulk of people who lost their job lost it permanently, meaning that their employer said, you're not coming back here. And in fact, in some cases, their employer was no longer a going concern. So notice on the right-hand side, though, that there's been a trade of that gray area, temporary job loss, for blue, permanent job loss. And the sum of those parts is still relatively high. And a large portion of that is about the same amount of hill that we climbed to get to the top of the Great Recession. So economists are concerned that we're not getting both of those moving down towards zero fast enough, and it means we're going to have lingering effects of this recession into 2021. And so much is now inside of getting the social constraints lifted in such a way to provide businesses confidence to rehire this large amount of people. But unfortunately, there's more. Some folks have completed temporary jobs and are now looking for work. Some people have left their job and are now looking for some other job, but chose to leave, or had chosen to leave their job. Other folks are just getting back into the workforce who had been in it previously. So this includes partners at homes who had to stay home because of childcare or school needs, who walked away from either looking for a job or working, and now are going back into the labor force. So that increase has exacerbated the number of unemployed and has made the November and December job numbers a little bit worse in the United States. But it's also just reminded us that there's a lot of other people out there who may have not been counted August, September, and October when students got back to school in the fall that now want a job back, as they're seeing a transition in 2021 back to something that looks more like normal school and childcare. And then there's new entrants in the labor force, high school and college graduates, generally speaking. So that rainbow look to the far right-hand side of this graph suggests we still got a lot of work to do in our labor markets to truly have recovery momentum. Well, what I want to do now is I want to look at the industrial level and see where most of the pain has happened. I kind of alluded to the idea already that lower wage workers have felt most of the brunt of this recession in terms of job loss. Here's April 2020 compared to April 2019, and you can see on the far right-hand side, industries like other services, hair salons and nail salons, those kind of places to work, food services and drinking places, bars and restaurants, and accommodation, hotels, motels, event facilities where we have concerts and basketball games and other places where people gather. Social constraints slow down our ability to work in those areas and really just to generate revenue from those businesses. So we saw a sharp cut in April, which began the labor market recession. By November, we'd seen recovery. So for the American economy, the period between April and November really had sort of, month-on-month growth, even though those industries on the far right are still at relatively high percentage cuts from where they were 1 year previous. So this is November 2020 compared to November 2019. Excuse me, that negative job growth, a problem in terms of keeping a lot of people unemployed. Unfortunately, December was a little worse. So the way to read those data for accommodation, or let's say hotels and motels and other places where people gather, we got 32.1% cuts in jobs from the previous year. So about 32 out of 100 people who were working December 2019, not working December 2020. In bars and restaurants, about 1 in 5. So that's a lot of people out of work. And unfortunately, in those two categories, a lot of people who make a relatively low wage, but have an ease of entry and exit into those jobs, and it can act as a career transition move. In the Great Recession, we saw people who lost jobs in real estate, construction, and other related industries move into things like retail, bars and restaurants, hotels and motels. As we started to get our economy back, those actually started to burgeon a little bit faster. Well, now thinking of the Great Recession, let's look and compare the evolution of jobs in the Great Recession and in ultimately the recovery of the American economy on the labor market front with the current recession by starting them in the exact same place. I converted them both to indices that start at 100 in November 2007 with the number of people working in the United States, and also January 2020 with the number of people working in that month in the United States. And we'll watch the evolution until we get back to full recovery, or until December 2020, as the case may be. Here's the American economy from November 2007 forward. So you can see this is just a smooth bowl shape. Job losses started November 2007. It took a couple of months to really get started. And when it started, unfortunately, we fell pretty hard. But it took a long time. It took about 26 or 7 months to actually get to the bottom. And then we started to slowly climb back up. And it took about 76 months overall to regain all the jobs that were lost. Hence the Great Recession. Here's the COVID-19 recession from January 2020 to December 2020. Same idea. The jobs cut were very quick. We saw pretty good momentum in the summer and the early fall, and then it started to curl in the sense that we saw a little bit of a slowdown in jobs growth. We need that black line to move toward the red dotted line to see true job market recovery and ultimately to gear up for overall economic recovery. The financial markets, however, have kind of just shrugged a lot of this off. And over the last 20 years, this is the evolution of the S&P 500 as a broad-based index of what's going on in our equity markets. Here are the last 3 recessions, including the one we're still currently in. I will talk more about the dating and how much longer we expect the current recession to technically last. But you can see that in the dot-com recession, which is that first shaded area, right around the time of 9/11, we were already sliding down in terms of our equity market values, and we hit bottom sometime in late 2002 and then started to climb up in the first decade of the new millennium, driven a lot by what was going on in housing markets and also just the revitalization of tech. Then it topped out and we saw the Great Recession cut values again, much more sharply than in the dot-com recession time, down to 735 on the S&P 500. Now I put that there because We had a long bull market since May 2009 when that 735 hit. And you can see we topped out at the end of 2020 right around 3,690 on the S&P. So that is amazing growth over that period. But the idea is that even with what happened last year, you can see down to 2652, there was a sharp cut in equity markets that quickly recovered. The quick recovery came for two major reasons. One, interest rates were cut very rapidly, and just like in the Great Recession, they were cut with the idea that we needed to have as much credit available and as much cash moving to try to revitalize the economy as possible. Equity markets love interest rate cuts. On top of that, the major companies that drive this index based on their size are the big 6 and 7, or 6 or 7, depending which way you look at it, tech companies. Companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook. They drove a lot of the growth here, especially over the last few years, and helped recover because our lives became more technologically focused. Us having this today on Zoom is a function of that change. So up the demand for those stocks went. So the two together have led to some amazing recoveries in not only stock prices, but really overall in the equity markets, regardless of what index you follow. Now, is there a price for that at some point? Well, certainly we should expect people to take profits off the table, but as long as interest rates remain relatively low and the expectations become the actual outcomes in the economy, the changes in prices should be more metered and more quote unquote rational rather than having irrational changes because of panic. Well, one way in which people panic at home is to build up debt because they just don't know any other way of gaining access to cash. This is the evolution of household debt balances in the United States on a quarterly basis starting in 2003. This is tracked by the New York Federal Reserve for the American economy, and that ends at the end of the third quarter of 2020, so September 30, 2020. This is mortgage debt. And these are inflation adjusted numbers because when you borrow money 12, 15 years ago, it has a different value to you than it does today. So you can see that hill run up very quickly as we've had a lot of people buying homes, and in some cases they should not have been buying homes. Thus, we hit a peak of debt. People lost their homes, the debt was relieved, and we saw that debt load fall, kind of a classic so-called debt cycle. Then over the last decade, it's been a slow run up in inflation adjusted terms, and we are not still above the amount we had built up before the Great Recession, even though we've had more people become homeowners. The reason, because we've had refinancing, we've had restructuring, and we've really just gotten more of a taming of our balance sheets than we saw in the last decade. Well, here's home equity lines of credit to add more to the household debt portfolio, auto loans, credit card loans, and I'm going to stop here because we expected credit card loans to jump a little bit when the recession began because we expected that people might not be able to put food on the table, keep their cars, stay in their houses, especially on the rental side, without sort of using both, if you want to put it this way, debit and credit markets, meaning cash and or credit. Well, one of the things that we saw is that the federal stimulus came so quickly and in such a robust fashion that it actually pushed that issue away. And one way to think about the way that things have gone so far in the COVID-19 recession scenario is that the federal government has basically traded its debt for household debt, meaning that it has built up more debt and more deficit spending to keep households from having to do it through transfer payments. So fiscal stimulus 1 and 2, as well as the enhanced unemployment benefits, all that has helped stave off an increase in the use of credit cards for the time being. Here's student lending and other ways that people borrow. So the good thing about this is, and with the equity market pictures I just showed you, you add all that together and the national financial picture looks good versus at least to this point, kind of fair to midland labor market recovery, but with some momentum. The International Monetary Fund does a quarterly forecast for the global economy, and they just came out with their 2021 and 2022 forecast, which they do every January. And the US is actually a pretty good forecast and one of the highest growth rates of the larger economies of the world. And China is not here, but China is actually growing a little bit faster than the US over this time. The negative year in 2020, however, creates a hole by which that big jump in 2021, which you see there, 5.1% in inflation adjusted growth for the US, is something to watch because we are starting at a lower number. And then we kind of tame that growth going into 2022 and probably forward to 2024, somewhere between 2.5% or 3%, assuming all the recovery momentum is a smooth, continuous recovery. Any hiccup in the way that the vaccines work, another strain of COVID-19, what we might end up calling COVID 2020 or COVID 2021, or I'm sorry, COVID 20 or COVID 21, regardless, we need to watch very closely that we don't have a hiccup somewhere that then sends business expectations and ultimately the hiring cycle back down again. Okay, so again, kind of fair to middling news on the financial front, relatively strong news. But now let's look at California and Del Norte County as a way of thinking more regionally and locally about where things are going and where they might be going over the next few years. Here's the latest data as of December 2020 for labor markets in California, Del Norte County, and in Humboldt County to kind of give you a way of thinking about another local regional example and also the statewide situation. So Del Norte County at 9.2% unemployment, a little larger change in the labor force, which suggests there might be a little bit more retirees or maybe some folks that have left Del Norte County, though Humboldt County and California are about the same, so not a whole lot of difference there. But in small rural counties in California, we don't want to lose too much labor force because when we won't go to rehire, we may struggle to find those folks. So from a workforce development standpoint, one of the biggest things to try to do is try to figure out ways that you can retain the local workforce so you don't lose them and kind of trade off for folks that might come to the local area due to quality of life, but not necessarily to work, meaning more retirees. That's not a bad thing. It's just something that makes local businesses struggle more to find workers depending on the types of businesses you have. If you look at economic recovery for California, and we think about it again, compared to the Great Recession, this is the same graph we saw above, but for the state of California. There's that blue bowl shape. I kept the seasonality in at this time because I'm going to compare that to a not seasonally adjusted index for the COVID-19 recession for California, which looks like this. So it took California about 56 months to get back to the same number of workers that we started the Great Recession with. And the COVID-19 situation, just like the national situation, sharp downturn, a little bit of flatness, then up with good momentum, but starting to curl a little bit the last couple of months. We need that black line to go up to the red dotted line, just like the national level, and we will see how the next couple of months go. We should expect a little bit more flatness, at least through January. If the vaccines get out there and we continue to lift the restrictions around the state, we should be in pretty good shape moving through the end of 2021 and into 2022. But it's going to take time, folks. It's not going to be a quick recovery or continued at that sharp momentum, unfortunately. And most economists predicted that when there was a wave of cases coming back, we would see that little hook take place. Just like above, we're going to look now industrially, but I'm going to do it month by month to really show you the evolution of the California labor market coming back. Here's April. So April was the tough month. May was relatively tough as well, but notice the industries where most of the cuts are happening: leisure and hospitality, other services, so bars, restaurants, hotels, event services and event places, all those same basic thing at the national level in terms of where most of the job cuts were felt. We also see our farmers on the far left-hand side affected. There's June, July, August, September, October, November. So continued momentum through the summer, where the beginning and the end of spring was a little shaky. Then we really got some movement, but December we gave some back. So for leisure and hospitality, the way to read that number is that compared to December 2019, there were 3 out of 10 workers who had a job in December 2019 that were not working December 2020. And for other services, it's 1 in 5, or about 20%. Those two buckets, leisure and hospitality and other services, are relatively large in California, about 20% of the overall workforce, and represent a lot of lower wage workers. So that's why we've seen so much damage in our lower wage working households and families, and the increase in social services demand, as well as the increase in nonprofit demand, and not having the revenues alongside of it because of the slowdown in the economy. Looking forward, California Department of Finance provides a forecast for employment alongside of the governor's budget, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. This is what it looks like. Again, using an index and putting the beginning of the index, if you will, equal to 100, November 2007. So we're going to see the same evolution of jobs we saw before with respect to the recovery from the Great Recession, and then this recession connected to that and beyond. There's the evolution from 2005 forward on a quarterly basis. There's the Great Recession shaded now on the left-hand side of the graph. And here is the current recession. Now, I said before that one of the things we're likely to see is that the end of the recession is here. We should expect to hear in the next maybe month or two a declaration that the technical aspects of the recession are over and we are now in quote unquote recovery. We don't expect a double dip as the IMF forecast and this forecast both tell you. Notice that as that shaded area, the second shaded area moving left to right, where you see the V, the cut there after the 110.5, we don't have another dip. So we have this sort of smooth movement back up to 110.0. And what those numbers are is that the 110.5 is where we started the recession, about 10.5% larger amount of workers than we were before the Great Recession. So by the end of that last run up to the beginning of the COVID-19 recession, we saw pretty decent labor market growth, not amazing historically, but pretty good. And we won't be back to that volume until maybe the end of 2024, according to the California Department of Finance. Now, California Department of Finance historically is a little bit more conservative than other economists out there who do forecasting for the California economy. But in terms of a forecast, the two major items are: one, it's not going to be over by summer this year. And further, it really depends on the pace at which we get people back to work. It's easily enough to think of that slope of that last segment toward the 110.0 getting a little bit more steep and getting us back to square, if you will, by the end of 2023 or maybe even mid 2023. But don't expect we're going to be back there in the next 12 or 18 months. If we get there that quickly, it'll be because so many things happen positively at once, it could not have been predicted. Well, let's look at Del Norte County as a way of contrasting it to California. And just like a lot of places in rural California, this is unfortunately the picture of Del Norte County with respect to the jobs volume after the Great Recession. We ran jobs up in the first decade of the new millennium and kind of ran them up too high based on the economy they were built upon, literally and unfortunately figuratively. Then it fell. Now, Del Norte County actually entered the recession from a job standpoint a little later than a lot of other parts of California, but when it entered it hard. And you can see that drop off here, and we never really got the volume of jobs back. Hence, the COVID-19 recession looks like the far right-hand side of the blue line. That is not a great picture in terms of moving back up toward that red line, but the one positive aspect of that black line is it's not as deep a cut as other places around California. For example, the Los Angeles area is still in worse shape on a percentage basis than Del Norte, even though those are kind of polar ends of the economic spectrum in terms of size and breadth of industries. But it's not a time to panic. It's just a recognition that there has been a continuous job loss basically since all this started in Del Norte County, and that we've got to start bringing workforce and economic development assets to bear to slow down the continued devolution of jobs locally. Looking at an industrial, so if we believe that that is the picture to describe what's going on in the labor market, we can now look industrially to see where a lot of the pain was. Here we go. So you see professional and business services took a pretty big cut. So did other services. Leisure and hospitality, not so much initially. And even education kind of hung around, as we'll see in a minute. But here's April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and then December, giving some back. So let's just go back to November for a minute. You can see a lot of the originally relatively hard hit industries. Information is relatively small. It's like software and publishing, and a lot of really around something that has to do with publishing, including software. But most of that's going to be around your newspapers and your cable TV and those kind of workers. Then you have professional business services. There just was not a lot of demand running around. So even those kind of industries fell. And that's different than a lot of other areas in California. Financial activity is the same. There just wasn't a lot of lending going on in Del Norte County enough to really sustain the current level. So you saw those cuts as well. Other services hit pretty hard. So a lot of industries cut and did not get enough comeback to keep jobs overall from falling. And then there's December, another hit. So Del Norte County, rural California, kind of typified. The one thing that is teachers were basically preserved, which is great. You can see education as well as the healthcare situation. So if you jam all those together, pretty decent job there, but a lot of job loss otherwise. So one of the things that this suggests is that where Del Norte County might face some longer term problems is in keeping certain businesses around and losing the capacity to hire back to provide some stability against the prison with respect to the core of its economy. So that's something just like a lot of coastal California, that if you're one or two major industry area, loss of that second industry, which could be an amalgam of a bunch of different industries against one core industry, can change the way in which people look about staying in that area, might be a working family, and having to go some other place to really find a new career and job. So watch for that. Again, it's an economic development and workforce development together challenge to try to solve. However, housing is another way of looking at what's going on locally. So the fact that Del Norte County, which is now going to be highlighted, has seen over the last 12 months a slight reduction in its median home price against a lot of other parts of California that have had relatively robust growth, might point to the idea that people are slowly starting to leave the area given the job situation. Again, something to watch. It's another metric to follow. On the ground, it might seem a little bit different because it's not much of a cut, and there's not an enormous number of jobs that have been cut in terms of the number of people, but it's going to start feeling that way once things start up again. It's like, oh, hey, wait a minute, that business isn't open anymore. These folks have left the area. It's something to watch. Here is, however, the current forecast for the next 12 months. So while Del Norte County has not grown that much in terms of median home price, Zillow actually sees them as growing about 10% over the next year or so. And that's because once we start to see more economic recovery momentum, almost every place in California is going to feel some positive gain in housing prices. Now, for some parts of California, that means in 2 years, it's going to be about 20 or more than 20% growth. For Del Norte County, it might be just about 5 or 7% when it's all said and done, given the negative of the last 12 months, and then potentially up about 10% this year, thinking about the sort of compounded change in those prices. So if this is going to play out, the one thing that's nice about that is it looks like we're going to preserve some housing wealth in Del Norte County. The problem is, and this is something that's true across California, that once the economic recovery is more complete, we're going to be talking about housing inequities again, just like we were talking about housing crisis before COVID-19. Here's a way of looking at that so-called K-shaped recovery, where high-wage workers have recovered a little bit more quickly in California than low-wage workers. These data come from a partnership at Harvard University with the Gates Foundation that are collecting data from all over the place to try to track the recovery. It's called tracktherecovery, all one word.org. And if you want a lot of data about California and the United States, this is a place to go to see a bunch of different metrics about watching the economy and trying to be as real time in those metrics as possible. Well, I say that, and then these data are actually just from the end of October. But the point here is that you can see a lot of the original damage in for both high wage and low wage workers, with one caveat. High wage workers in this context are folks that make at least $60,000 a year. Low wage are folks that make a maximum of $27,000 a year. But that split is a very large split, meaning that high wage workers basically flat from January to October in terms of overall job losses. About 28% of jobs that were there in January 2020 for folks that make 27,000 or less are gone. So you can think about this as a wild continuum from baristas at Starbucks because they contracted a little bit of what their total workforce was, to hospital workers because they didn't have as much happening outside of acute care, to having a theater that stayed closed. So those low wage workers having that many job losses tells a story about, again, social services demand and something to watch going forward with respect to workforce development. So there's the split. And now watching social services demand, thinking about the effects on our nonprofits at a time where donations have been short, thinking about what it means for rental properties and rising vacancies and how that can affect housing. Not having growth for low-wage workers can lead to a lot of problems, especially in rural areas of California when businesses want to hire back. So think about that with respect to workforce dollars and where to point those resources. But the trickiness in it is what, in a sense, training is going to be available if we can't get businesses open that want to rehire. We're hearing it around rural California that businesses want to rehire, they just don't have people applying. Part of that could be because of enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, but those are going to not be enhanced much longer. I'll take that back. I said that wrong. They're going to be enhanced for not much of a longer time period. From a small business standpoint, we're also watching closely these data. So same database tracking what it calls small business, which on a national comparison scale means businesses that have no more than 500 people. For California, that really is concentrated in businesses under 25 people. You can see here the total number of businesses that might be closed as of December 31 that were open January 2020 is about 36.7% down. So if you have about 37% of your businesses closed, that's a problem in terms of rehiring and really just generating economic vitality in your community. For leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, and hotels, maybe as much as 50%. Wow. So that's a large number, and you can see that split there. Now, whether or not this is true or not is question one, because remember, this is a database that's trying to use a lot of different data and trying to estimate in real time, which economists are not great at doing, generally speaking. But the second piece is that we don't know if these closures are permanent or temporary. If they're temporary, waiting for social constraints to lift, we might see them hiring and opening right away. But if they're permanent or they're on the precipice of permanent, that's where economic development and workforce development are going to see some serious challenges with those local businesses that ultimately would want to get back going and want to rehire quickly. That capacity might not be there. That's the scary thing, really, folks, at the end of the day, is whether or not those businesses will be there. Because we don't want to lose our regional hotels and restaurants, because those have a lot of good benefits, especially from a city and county revenue standpoint. We don't want prices to rise for local residents because the number of businesses that basically serve our local residents contract and leave fewer players in the marketplace. And we certainly don't want businesses, and unfortunately, this is the one thing that's not easy to solve, facing such high cost of operation on the other side of COVID-19 that while they might be currently temporarily closed, the social constraints get lifted, but the cost environment they find themselves in is too large to remain in business. So the challenge here is not so much saying, God, we got to save this one business downtown because they've been here for 75 years and they've got to stick around. Is that would that 75-year-old business be here in 12 months, even if you gave them those resources? So there's some really nasty decisions that economic development, cities and counties, and workforce development officials have to make in terms of training, providing resources, and just trying to get as many businesses around the corner as possible. And unfortunately, and this is why I start with the national outlook, so much of that depends on the broader context recovering in full. Well, like rural California, other places, the population in Del Norte has got older, and hence there's more people passing on than being born over the last few years in Del Norte County, which means that the natural increase in the population has actually been negative. Now, there has been a little bit of inbound from other countries, which is this net foreign change in the population, but the movement of net domestic or people coming from other places or leaving to go to other places has been all over the place. But for the most part, the last decade or so, people have left Del Norte County, where the last couple of years people have come in. You can see that big surge in 2018. Some of that is fire related, but the point is that the local population has gone up and down over time. What's important about watching the population change is that if you become older, more focused on being a retirement community, losing working families, and thus losing a core demand for local businesses that isn't, let's say, based on a fixed income amount of spending, it can change the dynamics of your community. And you have to watch whether or not that turns into a spiraling effect of local economic development. You really want balance, but that means you have to kind of think about what are ways in which we can attract a younger, maybe working families audience. And one of the beauties of this situation, if there's any real shining light in the labor market, is that you might see people looking for quality of life who have portable jobs, who want to live in the coast, and they want to go to Del Norte County and bring their tech job with them, believe it or not. That's something to watch over time and see if that actually happens. It's going to take a couple of years to figure out if that's happened with any real permanency, but it might. Okay, so what are we watching to wrap up? Should see low interest rates, which puts a lot of growth juice into the economy, which is good. We shouldn't see any increase of interest rates with significance until we have true recovery momentum. And whatever we see happen with the president and their push to spend, probably not going to change interest rates that much, which is good. Home prices are going to be affected by those low interest rates. You can see demand remain relatively frothy. And like I said before, we might see some movement around California from urban to suburban to rural. We've got to watch that nasty split between high wage and low wage recovery, The urban areas are feeling this much more deeply than our suburban and rural areas, but it doesn't mean that our suburban and rural areas are immune to that issue, and it still has a pinch on social services locally. Thus, the public sector has more pressure on it. The state coffers have actually gotten more filled than we expected. A lot of that because personal income and capital gains tax revenues have increased as tech and the equity markets have continued to burgeon in this scenario. Property taxes remain stable. That's one of the beauties of having relatively stable, if not growing, housing markets. But cities and counties still are probably spending more money on average than they're bringing in for sure, because we just don't have the right number of transactions to round out the revenue side of the house. We will see if one of the next spending packages out of Washington actually finances cities and counties. If it doesn't, we may have some real problems going forward if we don't have economic recovery. So the one thing to think about that's a key challenge is making sure that people manage their financial lives well as the federal government. As I said earlier, the federal government's basically traded debt now for household debt now, but we're gonna have to pay for that at some point. So a big question I usually get is, hey, does all this debt mean something bad for us? And the answer is it certainly puts more pressure on interest rates to remain low, inflation to remain low, and our ability to finance ourselves later if we need to stimulate the economy if the global economy believes that by doing that we have more risk in paying back the things we already owe. However, we're doing this at very low interest rates, which is a positive, and we are doing it for the right reasons in the sense that we've got to stave off a much more nasty recession. But it's going to be a little while, folks, and think 2023 minimum before we're out of the woods. Okay, with that, I am done with my presentation. I see a couple questions in the chat, but if I don't quite get to your question or you think of something later, you're more than welcome to email me at eyler@econforensics.com or find me on Twitter at my handle @Bobby7007, and I will take care of you. So we got a question here from Rosa that says, what accounts for the difference in time of when they entered the recession? A lot of it depends on the composition of the economy. So California entered it a little earlier than the US, but then came out of it because of tech growth that was faster than we saw in the other parts of the country on average. But once we got through that, we kind of flattened out in California, and then the US otherwise caught up to us, and then we all started to move simultaneously. So most of what accounted for it was the growth of tech in US. Oh, I'm sorry, the growth of tech in California versus the US. The other question you had is what would you say is the forecast timeline for us to start to see low rates taking effect? And I know I just kind of answered, but let me repeat it just in case. The lower rates rising, it'd probably be a couple of years before we see those things rising, and a lot of it would be based on economic growth more than anything else. So if we don't recover, don't expect interest rates to rise. Thank you, Rosa, for asking those questions. I'll wait about 30 seconds to see if anybody else has any questions. And if not, then have a great year, folks, and try to stay safe up there. It's been crazy just trying to get through this economically. And I know the more rural you are in California, the more tricky it is to really see through to the end. But we will get there. It's just going to take a lot of change in our parts and really seeing these vaccines and our social interactions get a little bit more focused on turning the corner. There will be a copy of this recording. So check in with Smart Workforce Center, and thank you again to Smart Workforce and to Wendy for sponsoring this. They will have it available for them for you, I should say, along with the slides. Thanks, folks, and take care and have a great year.